youth and women, right, in the midst of the Arab Spring in general, and the Egyptian Revolution in particular, in the midst of everything we have been talking about, the changing political landscape, the changing media landscape, and all of the changes and developments that have been taking place. Youth and women have a lot of opportunities to fight for their causes, spread their messages, and make their voices heard more than ever before. So I do believe, I'm one of the people who believe that there's a lot of opportunities. Despite all of the hardships and difficulties and challenges we've been talking about, there is a lot of opportunity for women, for youth, to play a significant role. Social media provide youth and women with the needed window to see the world and see the outside world, and to be seen by the outside world at the same time. This is very important. See the outside world and be seen by the outside world at the same time. And also the needed tools to network, organize, and mobilize on the ground. The affordability, accessibility, interactivity, and immediacy of these tools make them especially important in calling for socio-political change. In other words, not just political transformation, but also much needed social reform. So I'm reminding you that women are not, for example, using social media and new media only to call for political change, but also for social reform, for social rights, for fighting harassment, fighting violence against women, and calling for equal rights for women in their societies as well. So it's a socio-political transformation that social media is helping with. The growing youth activism is especially important and relevant when it comes to supporting women's issues, since both youth and women could be perceived as two sides of the same coin of activism. Many of the activists I showed you, they were both, in many cases, women and youth. They're young women at the same time. So as one woman puts it to me, she said, women can really be seen as the jumping on the bandwagon, or jumping on the same wagon with youth. When youth activism increases, women's activism will increase also, and vice versa. They're both two sides of the same coin. This is especially true since many of the young activists who assumed leadership roles in the political arena before, during, and after the Egyptian Revolution of 2011 were women, such as Isra Abdel Fattah, for example, who came to be known as the Facebook girl due to her prominent role in the April 6th movement and its Facebook page. The April 6th movement was initially a labor movement that started in a city called Al-Mahalla Al-Kubra in Egypt, when laborers started to go out to protest against the very unfair payments. They were not getting enough payments, and they felt very upset about it. And then it started to change from just a labor movement to a much wider movement and call for political and social reform. Isra Abdel Fattah is another young activist woman who played a very, very significant role, and she used her Facebook page very powerfully and became also an iconic image of protest and political activism as well. However, just like everything else, there is a good side and a bad side, and everything is not always rosy or as rosy as we want it to be. So there are also perceived threats and challenges for both youth and women. Again, from solidarity to fragmentation, the fact that people are now moving from a very unified, a solid, united front to a much more fragmented and much more divided political arena. A lack of structure and organization. Many of these youth movements, unfortunately, they had the passion and the desire for change, but they did not have very well entrenched, structured organizations on the ground. They did not succeed to really form very successful organized movements on the ground. And that, in my opinion, contributed to what happened in 2013, because they left a very big power vacuum in society. There was not enough organization on the civil society level, not enough structure. The rise of political Islam, although of course this has to be taken also with some kind of reservation or with a grain of salt, because there are different shades. When you talk about political Islam or Islamization, there are so many different movements with so many different shades and many different degrees and ideologies. We cannot put them all in one category or lump them all in one basket and say, okay, all Islamist movements are repressive, or all of them are against women's rights. This is not the case. So we have to be careful that there are so many different shades and many different degrees. But some people have been skeptical about the rise of political Islam in some of the Arab Spring countries. Educational, economic, and infrastructural constraints. Many of the Arab countries are still suffering from many economic, social, political, and infrastructural constraints. The reactionary patriarchal culture, especially in some of the most conservative traditional countries, where still women are not allowed visibility in the public sphere, although I must say here that women in a country like Yemen, for example, which is very traditional, very conservative, should be given credit for months and months and months of very persistent, very courageous, very visible protest on the streets, to the extent that when Ali Abdullah Saleh, the Yemeni president at the time, said, it is shame on women to go out in the street and protest side by men. How can they rub shoulders with men and be in the public sphere like that in the street? This is not appropriate in a country as traditional as Yemen. What did Yemeni women do? The next day they organized the largest women's protest ever, and they completely flooded all the streets of Sana'a, the capital of Yemen, and every other Yemeni city, completely in their traditional black garments, but they were completely determined, and they held banners saying to Ali Abdullah Saleh, it is not shame on us to protest and ask for our rights. It is shame on you to be a dictator and to deprive us of our own rights. So very, very strong message again. Unfortunately, creating an unsafe public space for women through things like sexual harassment, violence, or virginity testing. These have been some horrific incidents of, trying to, I would say, terrorize or scare women from political participation by doing some absolutely unacceptable things. Virginity testing that was done by some of the military officers on Egyptian women who were protesting in the heart of Tahrir Square. When I heard this at the beginning, I was like, no way, this could not be possible. I completely, denied the fact that it might even be possible. Unfortunately, it did happen. And one of the girls who had this test done on her was very courageous. She went to court and she raised a lawsuit, and she said this is unacceptable and it should never happen again. And countries, of course, like Syria, we talked about, the harassment, the rape on a massive scale. So this has been used as weapons in order to scare women and to really kind of deter them, if you will, from political activism and protest. The overshadowing and marginalization of women's issues. In other words, although women, as we said before, participate fully and completely with men, side by side, equally in the political sphere, in protest, in demonstrations, once the political aims are achieved, there is this attitude of, thank you ladies, you've done your part, now you can go back to the kitchen, right? So in other words, brushing off or marginalizing women and women's issues and just pushing them back again outside the public sphere, which is of course unacceptable because they were complete equal partners and they paid the full price for their protesting and political activism as well. The uncertainties ahead for youth and women, beside the opportunities and the challenges, there is also a lot of uncertainties. The future of youth and women's leadership and the gains that they can actually secure are very much related to the political and social future of their own respective countries, many of which are currently in flux without any clear map so far. So in other words, we cannot really say with any kind of confidence or certainty, oh, we are sure that the future of women's and youth leadership will go in this direction or that direction. Why? Because the countries themselves are very much in transition, in flux. There's a lot of change going on, a lot of political, social change is going on minute by minute, so we cannot assume with any kind of certainty what the future is going to look like for youth and women a few years from now. This ambiguity is applicable in countries where the struggle for freedom is still ongoing, like for example Bahrain and Syria, but it's also applicable in transitioning countries such as Tunisia, Egypt and Libya, which are still facing many challenges after overthrowing the repressive regimes and ousting their dictators. If you remember, we said before that ousting the dictator from office is one thing, but figuring out what to do next is the bigger challenge. And this is very true, that even in these transitioning countries, there is still a lot of uncertainty, a lot of transition, a lot of influx, and the roadmap is not clear. So, what would be the possible future scenarios for a country like Egypt now? There's the optimistic scenario, the pessimistic scenario, and the realistic scenario. The optimistic scenario is Egyptians have already broken the barrier of fear, and there is no way that they will go back to the pre-2011 era, because people learned that they can have a voice and that they can make a difference. So there is hope for national reconciliation over time. That's the optimistic scenario. The pessimistic scenario is Egypt is now so deeply divided and torn apart that the hope of reconciliation is a far-fetched dream. Violence and repression is likely to continue and escalate, and some of the people who hold this kind of pessimistic view even say it is on the verge or the brink of a civil war, just like the one in Syria or the one that took place before in Algeria. The realistic scenario, which is the one I personally prefer, which is the middle ground, indicates that there is a setback to the democratic process in Egypt, there is no question about it, but it may result in a self-corrective mechanism and useful lessons to build a better and stronger democracy in Egypt. So in other words, instead of having a very rosy scenario or a doomsday scenario, I prefer the middle ground of realism, being realistic and saying, okay, we have challenges, we have difficulties, we have problems, there's a setback to democracy, but it is hopeful that Egyptians will have self-corrective mechanism, they will correct all of these mistakes and go back again to a stronger and better democracy. This also requires reassessing the media's role in Egypt. Likewise, it is wise to adopt an approach of cyber realism, which avoids the two undesirable bipolar extremes of either cyber pessimism or cyber optimism, which tend to either overestimate or underestimate the role of new media and social media in socio-political transformation. In other words, just like there is an optimistic scenario, pessimistic scenario, and realistic scenario about the possible future of Egypt, we should also look at the role of media and new media in a similar way. We should avoid cyber optimism, which overestimates the role of social media and uses terms like Facebook revolution, the Twitter uprising, and so on, or cyber pessimism, which kind of underestimates the role of social media and says, oh, they did not really have any kind of impact. We should have the desirable middle ground of cyber realism, which gives social media some credit for being effective tools and catalysts for change, while at the same time avoiding overestimating this role, because at the end of the day, like we said before, it is always the people on the ground who can make the actual change happen. So after all, the media, like we said before, they are just tools for change, but they are not magical tools, and they can create this kind of change all by themselves. It is always the people on the ground who can make the change happen, and it's up to them to decide when and how it will take place and in which direction. So like we said before, social media could be effective tools. They can mobilize, they can amplify, they can network, they can help people to spread their messages. They're not magic, and they will not make the change happen by themselves. It's the people on the ground who can always choose to make this change happen and can decide when and how it's going to take place. So finally, a final word. So in looking ahead, we have to bear in mind that it would be wise to adopt a realistic approach in assessing the future of youth and women's leadership in the Arab world in general, and in Egypt in particular, in the context of the current waves of socio-political transformation. In doing so, it is important to acknowledge their gains and contributions, and the many future opportunities available for them, while also taking into account the challenges and the threats they are confronting and the uncertainties lying ahead. So again, we should not overestimate or underestimate what youth and women have done, and also the challenges they're facing and the possible uncertainties that are facing them in the future. They have achieved a lot. I think they will continue to achieve a lot, but there's also a lot of challenges that have been facing them, very serious challenges, and there's a lot of uncertainty as well. Similarly, it would also be wise to adopt a balanced, realistic approach in predicting Egypt's political future in the midst of current socio-political transformation, which acknowledges the valuable gains and victories which have been achieved, while also taking into account the serious current challenges and the threats lying ahead. It is equally important to adopt a balanced approach in reassessing the transformative Egyptian media scene with all its current changes and challenges. The key question now becomes, how can we return back to constructive dialogue to build a better Egypt? What role can youth and women play in this regard? And how can new media help in this process? This is the big question that many people, including myself, are asking and would like to have an answer for. Thank you very much, and I'm open to your questions. Thank you.